Hello everyone, I'm the storyteller and today I'll be your companion on a gentle journey into sleep. Before we begin, take a deep breath, relax, and don't forget to support by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Now lie back, close your eyes, and let this story guide you into a mysterious world filled with wonders, accompanied by the soft patter of rain in the background. That night, a heavy rain poured down. I remember clearly, it was around 11 p.m. when I was driving back home on the highway after a long business trip. The rain kept falling relentlessly, each drop pounding heavily on the windshield. The road was deserted with barely any other cars in sight, just the glow of my headlights piercing through the misty rain, illuminating the dark stretches ahead. I wasn't easily frightened, but that night, the atmosphere carried a strange feeling, like something was off. Just minutes after I turned onto a desolate road, I spotted a dark figure standing still in my lane. My heart pounded, and I quickly slowed down. In the dim glow of the headlights, the figure appeared faintly, tall, motionless. At first I thought it might be someone stranded waiting for help, but as I drew closer I realized that shape didn't quite resemble a person. The figure looked human-like, but not entirely. It stood in complete stillness, unmoving, seemingly unresponsive to my headlights. I couldn't make out any details, just a shadowy, indistinct blackness under the rain. When my car was about 20 meters from the figure, my car suddenly stalled. Everything inside went dark. The lights, the radio, and the engine stopped all at once. I panicked and tried to restart the car, but nothing happened. All around me, the rain continued to fall, the quiet tapping on the roof filling the eerie silence. I sat there, staring at the shadowy figure ahead. Suddenly a cold shiver ran down my spine. I felt as though something or someone was watching me from the darkness outside. The dim glow of my headlights barely illuminated the figure, which remained utterly still, as though waiting for me to make a move. With a trembling hand, I tried to start the car again. Still nothing. It felt as if an unseen force was holding my car in place, refusing to let me leave. The rain began to intensify, battering the windows and making everything outside blur. For a brief moment, I wondered if I was imagining it all. I reached down to grab my phone from my bag, intending to call for help. But just as I looked up, I was startled to see that the shadow had moved closer. Though I hadn't heard any footsteps, it was now a few meters closer to my car. My heart raced, and my hand holding the phone was slick with sweat. I tried to steady myself, keeping my gaze fixed on the shadow. It hadn't moved again, but I had the distinct feeling it was watching me, though I couldn't see any eyes. I looked around the car, hoping to find something that could help me get out of this situation. But apart from my phone and work bag, I had nothing that could serve as a weapon. I decided to step out to check the engine, hoping a small fix might bring it back to life. But as my hand touched the door handle, I froze. A faint laugh, distant and eerie, echoed through the quiet. It sounded like a child's laugh, yet somehow far away, coming from nowhere. I quickly withdrew my hand, too terrified to open the door. Now I was truly scared. Everything around me felt unsettling. The rain seemed heavier, enveloping everything. I sat in the car, gripping the steering wheel, staring at the shadow, hoping it would disappear or something would happen to release me from this nightmare. Seconds ticked by, each feeling like hours. I had no idea how long I sat there. All I knew was that with each passing moment, my fear grew. And then suddenly my car jolted back to life. The lights, the radio, and the engine all turned on as if nothing had happened. Without a second thought, I started the engine and sped away, not daring to look back. When I finally reached home safely, I couldn't shake the memory of that shadow and the strange, unsettling sounds. I stayed awake all night, haunted by the image of the dark figure, wondering if it was just a trick of the mind or something real, waiting in the rainy night, ready to haunt anyone who passed by. This story could continue with smaller details, diving into the characters' emotions, thoughts, fears, helplessness, and the way they react to each event to draw the audience deeper into the suspenseful atmosphere. After that night on the highway facing the shadowy figure, I couldn't shake the eerie feeling it left behind. I kept wondering if it had just been a hallucination or something supernatural. To calm my nerves, I decided to get away from the city and join some friends on a camping trip in a remote forest in Washington state. We picked a weekend, and even though the forecast warned of rain, we went ahead with our plans. I figured that maybe being in nature would help me forget that unsettling experience. The first day went smoothly. We set up our tents, lit a campfire, and shared stories. But as night began to fall, the first raindrops started to patter on the tent roofs. The rain grew heavier, forcing us to put out the fire and retreat to our tents. The air became damp and colder, and a strange feeling crept over me. As the rain poured outside, it became a gloomy veil over the forest. All that remained was the sound of rain and the rustling of leaves in the wind. We decided to go to bed early, but I couldn't sleep. Everything was too quiet. I could hear every breath I took. Suddenly, I heard a faint voice calling out in the rain. The voice seemed distant, but unmistakably called my name. I sat up abruptly, my heart racing. I thought I was imagining things, but the voice called my name again. I strained to listen, trying to pinpoint the source. It was coming from outside the tent, deep in the dark forest. At first, I told myself it was probably just a prank by one of my friends, but I knew they were all fast asleep in their tents. Curiosity mixed with fear as I put on my raincoat, carefully unzipped the tent, and stepped outside. The rain was cold, each drop hitting my face like tiny needles. I shone my flashlight into the trees, casting strange shadows that swayed with the wind. "Is anyone out there?" I called, but only the rain replied. Suddenly the voice called again, closer and clearer. The tone was hauntingly familiar, like an old friend's voice. I pointed my flashlight toward the sound and saw only rows of trees stretching into an endless dark void. A chill ran down my spine, but I felt compelled to keep going. Step by step, I moved deeper into the forest, carefully following the light of my flashlight and staying alert to every sound around me. Finally, I stopped in a small clearing. There was no voice now, only the heavy sound of rain and darkness all around. I stood there, confused and bewildered. Why had I heard my name so clearly? As I turned to head back, a strong gust of wind swept through, lifting a few dry leaves into the air. At that moment, I felt something, or someone, standing behind me. It wasn't a voice this time, but a soft, icy breath on my neck. My heart pounded and a cold sweat trickled down my forehead despite the rain. "Who are you?" I whispered, hoping for an answer, but silence was all I got. It felt as if a shadowy presence was right behind me, close enough that I could feel its cold aura. Gathering every ounce of courage, I spun around, but there was no one there. Only the tall, dark trees stood there in the rain, almost as if they were watching me. I hurried back to my tent, my heart still racing. That night, I huddled in my sleeping bag, listening to the relentless rain tapping against the tent, each drop a haunting echo. The next morning, I told my friends about the voice and what had happened. They just laughed, thinking I'd made it up to scare them. But I knew what I'd heard was real. Part of me wondered if whatever that was had followed me from the highway that night, or if it had been waiting for me here, hidden in the depths of this forest. Whenever I think back, I can still hear that voice calling my name in my mind, like a reminder that there are mysteries in the dark that we humans have yet to understand. After that terrifying camping trip and the mysterious whispers in the forest, I couldn't escape the lingering dread. Each night, as the rain started to fall, I felt like someone was watching me, or I'd hear an eerie voice whispering, inviting me into the unknown. I told myself I needed a trip to clear my mind. This time I decided to drive to Mississippi to visit an old bridge stretching over a river. I'd heard stories of hauntings tied to this bridge, but I never thought I'd become part of one. The bridge was long, spanning a vast, rushing river below that filled the air with a constant murmur. By the time I arrived, a light rain had started. The sky was overcast, and a gentle breeze gave the air a chilly edge. Exactly the kind of weather I needed to shake off my strange thoughts and fatigue. I drove across the bridge, my headlights illuminating each segment while darkness and the soft patter of rain surrounded me. Suddenly, a cold shiver crept up my spine. Up ahead, where the rain formed faint glimmers in the beam of my lights, I saw a figure standing in the middle of the bridge. It was a woman, dressed in a long white gown, her hair disheveled and hanging low, her face angled downward, hidden from view. I slowly brought my car to a stop, gripping the steering wheel, my gaze fixed on her. I could hardly believe what I was seeing. She didn't move, standing still in the rain and darkness, alone and hauntingly still. One thought flashed through my mind. Maybe she'd had an accident or needed help. Summoning every ounce of courage, I opened the door and stepped out, determined not to let fear take over. The rain drenched me, each drop running down my hair and face, but I ignored it. All my focus was on the mysterious woman ahead. As I moved closer, I called out, "Ma'am, are you all right?" She didn't respond. She stood completely motionless, her back to me. I took a few more steps, trying to see her face through the rain. Then, in a moment, like something from a nightmare, she slowly turned her head toward me, deliberately, but her face remained lowered. "Are you okay?" I asked again, my voice trembling. Suddenly, she lifted her head, and I saw her eyes. They were empty, dark, cold, black as an abyss. Her face was pale, her lips bluish, and her stare pierced right through me, paralyzing me with fear. At that moment, a faint, chilling whisper filled the air. I wasn't sure if I'd actually heard it, but the words echoed in my mind. "Don't turn away. Don't leave me. Don't go." Unable to bear it any longer, I turned and ran, nearly stumbling as I scrambled back to my car. My heart raced, and it took me a few seconds to calm myself enough to start the engine. When I flicked on the headlights and glanced back through the rearview mirror, she was gone, as if she'd never been there. I drove away from the bridge, my hands still shaking, constantly questioning if what I'd seen was real or just an illusion. But deep down, I knew she had been there, and her whisper lingered in my mind, forever etched as a haunting memory. That night, and many nights after, I dreamt of her. She was there on the bridge, standing in the rain, her cold, dark eyes watching as if waiting for someone to come and take her away. But maybe that person would never come, and she would forever be the ghost of the bridge, waiting in the endless rain. After encountering the woman on the bridge in Mississippi, I felt as though a dark, invisible shadow was haunting me. Every rainy night I could feel her empty black eyes staring, as if she were standing right outside my window, silently watching. Desperate to escape this growing dread, I decided to drive somewhere new to clear my mind. My next destination was Pennsylvania, a place filled with legends, with old houses and abandoned lands that always hinted at mystery. The drive took hours, and by the time I reached the outskirts, the rain had started. The sky was heavy and dark, and each drop was cold and sharp. I decided to stop and find somewhere to rest for the night, but the area was strangely deserted. The streets were silent, with rundown houses and not a single person in sight. After driving through the rain for a while, I spotted an old, abandoned house, standing alone by the roadside. The house looked like it had been forgotten for a long time. Broken windows, a rotting porch, and moss-covered walls greeted me. With night approaching and the rain growing heavier, I had little choice. I decided to take shelter there, waiting for the rain to pass before continuing my journey. I grabbed a flashlight from my car, stepped out, and headed toward the house. The old wooden door creaked loudly as I pushed it open. Inside was a cold, dim space. Dust and cobwebs clung to every surface, and a damp, musty smell hung in the air, like no one had stepped inside in ages. I turned on my flashlight, its yellowish beam sweeping across each room, illuminating the shadows. Everything was silent. Even the sound of the rain outside faded into the background. I found a dry corner and sat down, trying to calm myself and listen to the rain to distract from the eerie silence. But after a while, I started hearing other sounds. At first, it was just a faint murmuring, like someone whispering somewhere in the house. I told myself it was only the wind, but the sound grew clearer, like a soft voice coming from upstairs. Curiosity mingled with fear, and though my heart pounded, I decided to go up. Each step on the staircase creaked under my weight, the air around me cold and oppressive. At the top, my flashlight caught a glimpse of a small room at the end of the hall. Its door was slightly open, and from within, a faint light seemed to reflect as if someone were standing inside. Holding my breath, I moved closer. When I gently pushed the door open, I saw an old wooden chair in the middle of the room, facing a large mirror, dusty and cracked. In the mirror, I saw a faint figure, a woman with long hair, pale skin, and deep black eyes. I froze, unable to believe what I was seeing. The woman in the mirror stared right at me. But when I turned around, the room was completely empty. A chill spread through me, emanating from the room itself. And then I heard a soft laugh, almost mocking. The figure reappeared in the mirror, closer this time, as if she were moving toward me from another world. I stumbled backward, terrified, and tripped, dropping my flashlight, which went out. Darkness engulfed me, and in that instant, I felt her presence right behind me, her icy breath brushing against the back of my neck. Without thinking, I scrambled to my feet and ran out of the room, bolting down the stairs. Despite the pouring rain, I dashed out of the abandoned house, jumped into my car, and sped away in absolute terror. When I glanced back in the rearview mirror, the house was cloaked in darkness, but I couldn't shake the memory of those cold black eyes in the mirror, as if she wanted to pull me in. That night, I drove without stopping, leaving behind that haunted house and the mystery I knew I'd never dare to revisit. That abandoned house became a terrifying memory, like a doorway to another world where lost souls linger, waiting for someone to come and listen to their tragic tales. After the experience at the abandoned house in Pennsylvania, I was utterly drained by fear. The memories of the woman in the mirror and her cold, empty eyes haunted me every night. I decided to return home to Texas, hoping I'd find peace in familiar surroundings. But it seemed things weren't going to be that simple. That night, a massive storm hit Texas. The wind howled through every crack, trees toppled outside, and the rain pounded against the roof like relentless drumming. It was well past midnight, and I tried to sleep. But every time I closed my eyes, terrifying images returned to me. The empty eyes in the mirror, the dark figure on the bridge, and the whispers in the forest, all seemingly determined to torment me. Amid the violent storm and thunder, I heard a strange sound cutting through the chaos, a knocking at the door. At first I thought I was imagining it, but the knocking came again, slow and steady, echoing through the rain-soaked night. A chill ran down my spine, and the familiar dread began to rise again. I hesitated, hoping the knocking would stop, but it continued, insistent and unrelenting. Who could possibly be knocking at my door in the middle of a storm? The whole neighborhood was silent, everyone likely huddled indoors, and no one in their right mind would be out in this weather. Summoning my courage, I got up and approached the door. The faint light from the street lamp cast a blurred glow through the rain-soaked window. Just as I reached the door, the knocking stopped. I held my breath, pressing my ear to the door, listening. An eerie silence filled the air, broken only by the sound of rain and the whistling wind. I exhaled, thinking maybe it was just my imagination. But as I turned to walk away, the knocking resumed, louder this time, like someone was growing impatient. "Who's there?" I called, my voice shaking. No response, just the rhythmic, insistent knocking. Fear seeped into my bones, but I made myself open the door to see who was outside. The door swung open to the gusting wind and rain hitting my face. Standing in front of me was a stranger, a tall, gaunt man dressed in black, soaked from head to toe. His hair was wild, eyes sunken, and on his face was a faint, unsettling smile. "Who are you? What do you need?" I asked, trying to steady my voice. The man didn't answer, just stared at me. His gaze was icy, and there was something oddly familiar about him. I felt as though I'd seen him somewhere before, but I couldn't place it. His eyes made me shiver, and his smile only added to my unease. "Do you need help?" I asked again, but he still didn't respond. Instead, he raised his hand and pointed directly at me, as if trying to convey some kind of message. Then, in a low, raspy voice, he said, "Don't believe anything. Your eyes show you." His words slipped through the air amidst a flash of lightning, and then he turned and walked back into the storm, leaving me standing there, stunned. I watched him go, but within seconds he vanished into the downpour, as if he'd never been there at all. I stood frozen, my heart racing, trying to comprehend what had just happened. His words echoed in my mind. "Don't believe anything your eyes show you." After stumbling back inside, I shut the door, trying to calm myself. I told myself he was just a stranger caught in the storm, but deep down I knew something wasn't right. There was something far more sinister behind his words. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I looked at the window, I imagined the man standing there, staring in at me from the darkness. His words played over and over in my mind, like a haunting warning I couldn't shake. The next morning, after the storm passed, I went outside to look for any trace of him. But there was nothing, no footprints, no evidence that anyone had been there. The neighbors hadn't seen or heard anything unusual that night. Maybe it was all just a hallucination. But I knew the feeling he left behind wasn't just in my head. His warning had planted itself deep in my mind, and I couldn't escape the idea that something or someone was playing a twisted game with me, making me question everything around me. The stranger's words during that stormy night changed how I saw the world. From that point on, I kept wondering, can I trust what I see, or is there something hidden in the shadows, waiting to pull me into a world of mysteries and horrors that I might never escape? After the strange encounter with the man during the storm in Texas, I decided to head to Alabama to stay at an old family house. It was a place I'd lived in as a child, but since we'd moved away, it had been left empty, only occasionally visited for cleaning. I thought that returning to this old home might make me feel safe, away from the bizarre events that had been haunting me recently. The first night, there was quiet. I turned on every light in the house, trying to create a warm, secure atmosphere. After dinner, I walked around, checking each room to make sure all the doors and windows were locked. A light drizzle outside made a gentle sound, easing my nerves. I was sure I'd finally get a good night's sleep. But everything changed around midnight. I was lying in bed, trying to drift off, when I noticed a strange light flickering from the basement stairs. I sat up, heart pounding. I knew I was alone in the house, and I was certain I'd turned off all the basement lights before going to bed. I sat still for a moment, telling myself it was just a trick of the mind. But when I peeked through the crack in the door, the light was still there, faintly glowing from below. With no other option, I decided to check it out. Grabbing a flashlight, I stepped out of my bedroom and moved cautiously toward the basement stairs. Each step creaked under my weight, the sound echoing through the quiet house, adding to my tension. As I reached the basement door, I hesitated. The light flickered from beneath the door, like a small flame wavering in the darkness. Taking a deep breath, I tightened my grip on the doorknob and slowly pushed it open. I shone my flashlight down into the basement, its beam mingling with the strange light, but I couldn't see its source. In the corner of the basement, an old oil lamp lay on its side, but it had been broken for years and couldn't possibly be glowing. As I stepped onto the final stair, the light suddenly went out, leaving me in total darkness. My heart pounded, and the silence was almost deafening. Just as I turned to leave, I heard a soft whisper from behind me. "You're back again, aren't you?" The voice was so faint, like a breath in the dark, and a chill ran down my spine. I turned around, but no one was there. The darkness pressed in, and the rain outside felt like it was miles away, separated from the eerie quiet of the basement. I couldn't explain where the voice had come from, but it sounded like someone who had once lived here long ago. Then, in the corner of my eye, I saw a shadowy figure, a faint shape watching me. It was the outline of a woman with long hair, her face pale and hollow-eyed. She stood silently, her gaze heavy and empty, as if trying to convey some message. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and bolted up the stairs. As soon as I slammed the basement door shut, the strange light reappeared through the crack, brighter this time, like a flame burning intensely. I didn't dare look any longer and rushed back to my room, locking the door behind me. That night, I sat curled up on the bed, unable to sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the woman's face in the darkness, her empty eyes and cold smile beckoning me toward a shadowy world. At dawn, I packed my things and left the house immediately. I couldn't stay there another night. I didn't understand the strange light or the whispering voice in the basement, but I knew something terrifying lingered in that house. Maybe the woman's spirit was still there, trapped between two worlds, waiting for someone to return. Since that day, I've never gone back to the house in Alabama. Whenever I think about it, I hear the whisper from the basement and see that strange light in my mind, a haunting reminder that there are mysteries in the dark that are better left unexplored. After the horrifying experiences in Texas and Alabama, I decided to go farther north, hoping the trip would help me escape the haunting memories that had plagued me. Maine, with its rugged coastlines and breathtaking scenery, seemed like the perfect destination. I'd heard tales of the mysteries along its shores, especially the ghosts of sailors who were lost to the cold, unforgiving waters. I arrived in Maine on a dreary evening, just as a light rain began to fall. The sea breeze carried a chilly bite, mingling with the scent of salt. I rented a small seaside cottage where it would just be me and the crashing waves. The vast empty beach stretched out, cloaked in a gloomy but enchanting atmosphere. I thought that perhaps a quiet night by the ocean would help me feel more at ease. As night fell, I stood on the beach, listening to the waves and staring out toward the dark horizon. The rain began to pour more heavily, and I was just about to head back to the cottage when I noticed something strange in the distance along the shore. A shadowy figure appeared, faint under the rainfall. Even without light, the figure was distinct against the darkness, as if illuminated by some unseen source. I looked closer and realized it was a man dressed in the old attire of a sailor, standing still and gazing out over the ocean. At first, I thought it was simply someone out on the beach in the rain, but I quickly noticed something unusual. The man didn't move. He showed no signs of life. He just stood there, like a statue, completely still amidst the sounds of waves and rain. A chill ran down my spine. I couldn't explain why, but I found myself moving closer, as if drawn by an invisible force. As I approached, I saw a deep sadness etched onto his face, and his hollow, empty eyes stared out at the sea as if waiting for something, or someone, lost to the distant waters. I called out, "Who are you? Do you need help?" Suddenly the man turned to face me. I froze at the sight of his face, pale as death, with lips drained of color and dark, hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through me. He said nothing, only stared at me with that empty gaze. But I could feel his sorrow, like he'd been trapped there for centuries, unable to find peace. I took a step back, my heart pounding with fear. Just as I was about to turn and leave, a strange sound came from behind me. It was a whisper, a murmuring of many voices blended together, carried by the cold sea breeze. I looked back and saw a group of shadowy figures gathered around the man. More ghostly sailors, each dressed in worn, old uniforms, with empty eyes and expressionless faces. They stood in silence, their dark eyes fixed on me, but also staring out at the ocean. The whispering grew louder, a haunting melody mingling with the sound of the waves. I couldn't understand the words, but the sound was laced with a deep, lingering sorrow, and an unfulfilled longing. In that moment, I realized they were the spirits of those lost at sea, souls who would never return to their families and friends. These were souls trapped between worlds, unable to find peace, and each time it rained, they appeared, searching for the release they would never attain. I stood there, frozen, unsure of what to do. Part of me wanted to run, but another part felt sympathy for these lost souls. The rain continued to fall, and the ghostly figures remained still, their whispers echoing in the night. After a long while, the group of apparitions began to fade, as if carried away by the wind. Only the lone sailor remained, his eyes filled with despair. He looked at me one last time before fading into the darkness, leaving me alone on the beach, haunted by the sadness I'd just witnessed. That night, I returned to the cottage, unable to sleep. I could still hear the waves crashing, and it seemed that, in the gusts of wind, I could hear the faint whispers of those lost souls. I didn't know how to help them, but I knew that each rainy night they would appear, wandering the shoreline, waiting for something they would never receive. Maine, with its wild coastlines, is more than just a place of natural beauty. It's a realm of lost souls, those who gave everything to the sea. And perhaps they will always remain the ghosts of the ocean, eternally searching for a peace that will forever elude them. After my journey to Maine, the images of the lost souls by the shore haunted me, etched into my mind like a scar that wouldn't heal. I began to wonder if I'd somehow become a witness to things not meant for ordinary eyes, as if some invisible force was pulling me toward lost souls and forgotten stories. I thought maybe I'd find peace somewhere far away, somewhere untouched by the sorrow of restless spirits. California seemed like the perfect escape, a place of sunshine and lively energy. But, as fate would have it, things changed as soon as night fell. That night, I was driving along an empty road on the outskirts of a small town when the rain started falling. It wasn't heavy, but steady, and it left a misty sheen across the windshield. The road was eerily quiet, with only the sound of the rain and the hum of the engine filling the silence. When I reached an old bridge, a structure of weathered wood and rusted iron, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As I passed under the bridge, I heard an unusual sound. At first, I thought it was just the rain hitting the water below, but as I listened more closely, I realized it was something else. A cry. It was the soft cry of a child, carrying with it a deep sadness and loneliness that sent a chill down my spine. I felt myself freeze for a moment, my heart racing, but curiosity took over, urging me to investigate. I turned off the engine, grabbed my flashlight, and stepped out into the rain, making my way toward the space beneath the bridge. The crying grew louder, each sob echoing in the damp air, haunting and melancholic like a spirit left behind. The area beneath the bridge was dark and damp, with small puddles formed by the dripping rainwater. I shone my flashlight into every corner, searching for the source of the sound, but found nothing. The crying continued, soft and persistent, but it was impossible to tell exactly where it was coming from. "Is someone there? Do you need help?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. There was no response, only the unrelenting sound of crying. I took a few more steps forward, feeling a chill creep down my spine. Part of me wanted to turn back, but another part felt compelled to stay, drawn by a need to understand what was happening. Then, in the faint light of my flashlight, I saw it. A small figure, a child maybe 5 or 6 years old, stood just a few feet away. The child's hair was plastered to his forehead from the rain, his small frame shivering in the cold. His eyes, they were hollow, dark, like empty wells that seemed to go on forever. I took a step back, trying to steady myself. The child stared at me, eyes filled with a sorrow that felt ancient and endless. After a moment, he spoke, his voice barely a whisper that carried through the rain. "Don't leave me. Don't leave me here alone." The words lingered in the air, each syllable sinking into my mind, heavy with despair. I felt an overwhelming sadness emanating from him, like he'd been stuck here for years, waiting for someone to finally come. "What do you need? How can I help you?" I asked, my voice shaking. But the child didn't answer. He just stood there, his empty eyes fixed on me with that same sorrowful gaze. Then, slowly, he began to fade back into the darkness under the bridge. I tried to follow him with my flashlight, but he was gone, leaving only shadows and the echo of his last words. A wave of fear washed over me, and I stumbled back to my car, started the engine, and sped away. But even as I left, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was leaving something important behind. I glanced in the rearview mirror, but there was no sign of him. Still, his voice echoed in my head. "Don't leave me. Don't leave me here alone." Back in town, I tried to learn more about the bridge and found that locals had their own stories about it. Years ago, they said, a couple had abandoned their young child under that very bridge during a stormy night. The child had wandered in search of them, crying and calling, until exhaustion took him. Since then, his spirit had remained, waiting every rainy night for someone to come for him. That story only deepened the chill that ran through me. I began to believe that somehow I'd been pulled into the sorrow of these wandering souls, those lost and unable to move on. And every time it rains, I still hear that faint, sorrowful cry in the back of my mind. A plea from a child who was left behind, a cry for help that will never be answered. After countless encounters with strange and terrifying phenomena, I had almost given up on the idea that I could escape the fear that had taken over my life. From the shadowy figure on the bridge to the faceless woman in the abandoned house and the weeping child under the bridge, it was as though an invisible thread was guiding me toward inexplicable experiences. Still, I clung to the faint hope of finding a peaceful night's rest somewhere, somehow. I continued my journey south, ending up in Georgia, where I booked a room at an old hotel famously known as a resting place for solitary travelers. Built in the 19th century, the hotel had classic architecture and endless winding hallways. As soon as I walked through its doors, I felt a strange, oppressive energy. The air felt thick, almost frozen in time, as though life had left this place long ago. That evening, after eating and resting for a bit, I decided to take a walk around the hotel. The dim, yellow lights cast shadows across the old walls, creating a space that felt both familiar and otherworldly. It was so silent that I could hear every step echoing down the hallway. As I was walking, I saw a man standing with his back to me, just a short distance away. He was tall and dressed in an old, dark suit. He didn't move, just stood there under the faint glow of the lights. I assumed he was another guest and didn't pay much attention at first, but as I walked closer, I noticed something strange. He was completely still, with no reaction to my approach, as if he didn't even notice I was there. Curious, I moved around him to get a look at his face. The sight froze me in my tracks, my heart pounding. The man had no face. There were no eyes, no nose, no mouth, just a smooth, featureless expanse where his face should have been. I stumbled back, terrified but unable to look away. Then, somehow, he turned his head toward me. Despite having no eyes, I felt his gaze boring into me, as though he was trying to convey some kind of message that I couldn't understand. A cold wave of fear washed over me, my hands shaking. Part of me wanted to run, but my feet felt glued to the floor. We stood facing each other, suspended in a silent, chilling standoff, the weak light casting shadows over his blank, horrifying face. Suddenly, the man raised his hand, pointing down the hallway to a door at the end. His fingers were unnaturally long and thin. He didn't speak, he simply gestured. Then, without a sound, he turned and glided past me, disappearing into the shadows as if he had never been there at all. I stood there, trying to catch my breath, but my eyes kept drifting toward the door he had pointed at. A strange, inexplicable pull drew me toward it, even though I knew I should turn back. Step by step, I approached the door, my heart pounding harder with each step. The door was slightly ajar, and darkness loomed beyond it. Gathering what little courage I had left, I pushed the door open. The light from the hallway seeped in, casting a faint glow over the room. At the center of the room was a large, dusty mirror, and in the dim light, I saw my own reflection staring back at me, distorted and shadowed. I stepped closer to the mirror, staring into it. Then, to my horror, I noticed something unsettling. My face in the reflection was slowly fading. The outlines of my features were disappearing bit by bit, just like the faceless man. Panicking, I stumbled back, feeling a deep chill spread through my body, as though I was losing myself. Behind me, I heard footsteps echoing softly, and I knew he was there, standing right behind me like a phantom. In a moment of sheer terror, I turned and ran out of the room, slamming the door shut behind me. I sprinted down the hallway, never once looking back. When I finally reached my room, I locked the door and collapsed, shaking from head to toe, feeling as though I had narrowly escaped something far worse than I could imagine. The next morning, I left the hotel without a second glance. As I passed by the front desk, I asked the receptionist about the faceless man. She looked at me strangely and shook her head, saying, "We don't have anyone like that here. But there's a story. Long ago, a man disappeared in that very room at the end of the hallway, leaving no trace. And it's said his spirit still wanders here, searching for the face he lost." A shiver ran down my spine as I left the hotel, vowing never to return. That night, back in the safety of my own home, I couldn't bring myself to look in the mirror. But even now, every time I catch my reflection, I feel as if part of it is slipping away. I can still sense that faceless man's presence, watching from the other side, continuing his endless search for the face that was lost. I arrived in a small town in New Orleans, hoping to find a place to rest before continuing my journey. After the supernatural experiences I'd been through, I wished a night in a quaint old hotel might bring some peace. The hotel, built in the 19th century, felt like a relic from the past, with its long hallways, creaking wooden staircases, and an eerie stillness that seemed to linger in the air. From the moment I stepped into the lobby, I sensed that time had stopped here. The hotel manager, an older man with a stern face, greeted me with a cold, distant gaze that added to the unsettling atmosphere. After checking in, I wandered through the hallways, and I noticed a door at the end of a corridor with the number 313. The door was firmly locked with a small sign that read, "Do not enter." Curious, I asked the manager about the room. He looked at me, his face expressionless, and said in a low, grave voice, "Don't concern yourself with that room. It's not meant for guests." His warning sent a shiver down my spine, but I brushed it off, convincing myself there was no reason to worry. That night, however, as I tried to drift off to sleep, I had a strange, vivid dream. In it, I was walking down the dimly lit hallway, my footsteps echoing off the old walls. As I approached room 313, the door slowly creaked open, and I glimpsed a shadowy figure standing silently inside, watching me with an unblinking gaze. I awoke in a cold sweat, my heart racing, the uneasy feeling from the dream clinging to me. The following night, after dinner, I decided to take a stroll through the hotel to see if my mind was playing tricks on me. As I reached the end of the corridor near room 313, I noticed the door was slightly ajar, and a faint light was shining from within. Despite the manager's warning echoing in my head, curiosity won over. I cautiously pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was dim and covered in dust, as though it hadn't been touched in decades. A weak light from a ceiling lamp barely illuminated the moldy walls and worn furniture. In the center of the room was an old wooden chair, gently rocking as if someone had just stood up from it. But what drew my attention most was a large mirror in the corner, draped with a dark red cloth. Compelled by an urge I couldn't ignore, I approached the mirror and carefully pulled the cloth away. In the reflection, the room appeared faint and shadowed, and then I saw something terrifying. I wasn't alone in the mirror. Behind me stood several shadowy figures, all faceless, their heads tilted toward me with empty black eyes, as if their souls had been completely erased. My heart nearly stopped as I looked at the figures in the mirror. I turned around, but the room was empty. When I looked back into the mirror, the shadowy figures remained, staring at me with hollow eyes. Then, one of them slowly raised a hand and pointed directly at me. A suffocating feeling overcame me, as though the figure was trying to drain the life from me. In my panic, I heard a faint, sorrowful whisper from the mirror, each word heavy with despair. "Help me. Save us." Their voices blended together, creating a chilling harmony of sorrow that seemed to come from another world. I understood that these spirits were trapped within the mirror, unable to escape, and now they were reaching out, trying to pull me in to free them. Suddenly, I noticed my own reflection fading, my features disappearing as if I too were becoming one of the faceless figures. I stumbled back, feeling an icy chill spreading through my body as I realized I was losing myself, bit by bit. Desperate, I turned and bolted from the room. But as soon as I crossed the doorway, I found myself standing in front of room 313 again, caught in a dreadful loop. I panicked, trying to run back to my room, but each time I opened a door, I would find myself back at the hallway leading to room 313, with the door open, inviting me back. Realizing I was trapped in this endless loop, I decided to confront the mirror once more, hoping for a way out. I stood before it, staring at the fading outline of my face, praying, hoping for some kind of release. In that moment of despair, I heard one final voice, chilling and heavy. "We lost ourselves. You will be one of us." Oh. In a burst of fear, I struck the mirror, shattering it. The sound of breaking glass echoed around me, and everything went dark. When I opened my eyes, I found myself lying in the hotel hallway, the lights back to normal, everything quiet as if nothing had happened. Trembling, I stood up, realizing I had escaped the nightmare. The next morning, before leaving, I asked the manager about room 313. He looked at me in silence for a moment before he said, "That room belonged to a family trapped in a fire long ago. No one survived, and since then, their spirits have never left." As I walked out of the hotel, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the glass door, and I could feel that something was different. Although I had escaped the hotel, I knew that part of me remained behind in room 313, forever a part of those lost souls searching for freedom. After all the strange experiences I'd witnessed, peace seemed like an impossible dream. Each night, memories of faceless shadows, hidden figures, and whispers from nowhere kept my mind restless. Hoping to escape this endless unease, I decided to retreat to the quiet of a cabin in the remote forests of North Carolina. The cabin's owner had assured me that the area was completely secluded, a place where even the silence could help me finally find some peace. I only needed to stay for a few nights, just enough to reclaim the sense of calm I'd lost. I arrived late in the afternoon, under a drizzling rain that was quickly swallowed by thick mist seeping through the dense trees. The cabin was small and tucked into the shadows of the forest, its dim light barely pushing through the fog that seemed to cling to everything. Before leaving, the cabin's owner left me with an odd warning. "If you see a house in the mist, don't go near it." I brushed off his words with a slight chuckle, assuming it was just an attempt to add a bit of thrill to the stay. After all, who would believe in a house in the mist? But that night, as the fog thickened and swallowed the forest around me, I felt the weight of his words more acutely. The sound of rain pattered on the cabin's roof, a steady rhythm mixed with the faint rustle of the wind through the trees. The mist outside had grown so dense that even the cabin's small light felt like it was struggling to cut through the shadows. Sitting by the window, I stared out into the vast blanket of white, and then, through the rain and fog, I noticed a faint light in the distance. I froze, my gaze fixed on the light, straining to understand what it was. Slowly, I opened the cabin door and stepped outside, the chill of the mist creeping around me as the rain tapped softly on my coat. The light seemed to shift, moving between the trees, drawing me deeper into the forest. Despite my better judgment, curiosity compelled me forward. I walked through the mist, following a narrow, overgrown path through the woods. As I drew closer, the light became clearer, revealing a small, run-down house tucked between the trees. Faint light seeped through a window, casting an eerie glow in the rain-soaked night. I stood there, rooted to the spot, as though time itself had stopped. The house exuded an odd sense of abandonment, but it was more than that. It felt frozen, as if it had been left behind by the world. Just then, I heard a faint whisper from within, breaking through the quiet of the rain. "Someone, please help." The voice was so soft yet so clear, carrying a trace of desperation. I felt a surge of dread. Part of me wanted to turn back to the cabin, but another part couldn't resist finding out more. I stepped onto the house's creaky wooden porch and carefully pushed the door open. Inside, the house was dark and covered in dust, with cobwebs clinging to every corner. The smell of mildew hung thick in the air, as if no one had stepped inside for decades. I shone my flashlight around the room and saw a large mirror in the center, covered in dust and reflecting a faint, distorted image of the room. As I moved closer, I caught my own reflection in the mirror, a shadowy version of myself, dimmed by the darkness surrounding me. But then, I saw another face behind mine, a woman with long, pale hair and empty, sorrowful eyes staring straight into mine. I spun around instantly, but the room was empty. Looking back into the mirror, her face remained, her hollow gaze meeting mine as if pleading with me. My throat tightened, and my heart pounded as a chilling sense of unease crept through me. "Someone, stay with me." Her voice was faint and filled with a deep sadness, like a whisper from beyond. Then, more shadows began to emerge in the mirror. Figures with blurred faces and empty eyes slowly filled the room in the reflection, all watching me with silent, haunting stares as if waiting for something. I stumbled backward, terror washing over me. The shadows in the mirror seemed to press closer, their cold presence pulling at me, as though they were trying to drag me into the mirror to join them. Panicking, I turned and ran out of the house, slamming the door behind me and dashing through the rain. I could feel something, someone, following close behind, the weight of their eyes fixed on my back. The rain grew heavier, pounding on my coat as I pushed through the fog, refusing to look back. When I finally reached the cabin, I slammed the door shut and leaned against it, heart racing and breath ragged. I stayed curled up on the bed for the rest of the night, unable to close my eyes. The rain continued its relentless tapping on the roof, but occasionally I thought I could hear a faint whisper outside the window, a distant, desperate call for help from lost souls wandering in the mist. At dawn, when the rain had finally eased, I packed my things and left the cabin without a backward glance. But even now, whenever it rains, I can still see the house in the mist and the hollow eyes staring at me through the mirror, a memory that will never quite fade. That night, New York City was drenched in rain. Heavy raindrops hit the streets, pooling around the faint, flickering glow of the streetlights. It was close to midnight, but I was still driving, picking up passengers in the rain-soaked city. The dampness of the night made the air colder than usual, and the wet streets combined with the dim light created an atmosphere that felt both somber and surreal. I drive for a rideshare service, usually wrapping up my shift around 11 p.m. But tonight was different. I'd finished my route and was ready to head home, but just as I was about to turn off the app, a new ride request popped up. The passenger's name was Anna, and she needed a ride from a quiet street in the outskirts to the center of the city. Something about it felt odd, but I shrugged it off and accepted the request, thinking it would be my last ride for the night. When I arrived at the pickup location, no one was waiting by the road. The rain continued its soft, steady drumming on my windshield, blending with the sound of the wind rustling through the trees that lined the street. The entire area was desolate, the dim streetlights casting eerie shadows over the wet leaves trembling in the rain. I waited for a few minutes, glancing around, hoping to see someone approach. The street was empty, and I was on the verge of canceling the ride when suddenly the back door opened. A woman climbed in, her long, dark hair soaked from the rain, covering most of her face. She wore a black coat and didn't look at me as she settled into the back seat. She sat silently, not saying a word, lost in thought. I could feel a coldness filling the car, as if the rain itself had seeped in with her. "Good evening. I'm your driver. Where would you like to go?" I asked, attempting to break the tense silence. She didn't respond immediately, her gaze fixed outside the window. After a long pause, she whispered in a soft, almost inaudible voice, "To the city center, please." I nodded and began driving, feeling the atmosphere in the car grow heavier with each passing moment. The rain outside continued to pour, drumming against the windows in a repetitive, somber rhythm. The road ahead stretched out like a dim, shimmering path, illuminated only by the streetlights that flickered as we drove through. We passed through long, empty streets, and every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw her sitting there, her eyes staring blankly out the window, seemingly lost in another world. Her face was pale, and her expression held a sadness so deep it felt unfathomable. There was something about her that left me feeling uneasy. As we drove down a deserted road, she suddenly spoke, her voice low and echoing through the quiet of the car. "Do you believe in ghosts?" Her question startled me. Images of the strange events I'd experienced recently flashed through my mind, but I kept my composure and responded calmly, "I'm not really sure. Maybe I do, maybe I don't. Why do you ask?" She was silent for a moment, then replied, "Sometimes those who've left can't find peace. They're trapped between two worlds, unable to return but unable to move on." Her voice was cold, carrying a haunting weight that made a chill run through me. I glanced at the rearview mirror again and saw her staring straight at me. Her eyes held an eerie emptiness, not the look of someone alive, but something distant, as though it came from far beyond. In that moment, a chill crept down my spine, my heart pounding. I wanted to ask more, but I couldn't bring myself to break the silence again. The air in the car grew tense, and I focused on driving, hoping we'd reach the destination soon and end this unsettling ride. We continued down the dark roads, the rain never letting up, each drop joining with the hum of the engine to create a dreary, mournful tune. Then, she spoke again, her voice softer this time, but filled with a deep regret. "Do you know what it's like to be forgotten? To be left behind, as though you never existed?" I didn't know how to respond. I could only feel the sadness in her voice, as if she was carrying an invisible weight that no one else could see. I glanced into the rearview mirror once more, but this time the back seat was empty. I froze, my eyes wide in shock, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. She had vanished. The seat was empty, no trace of her at all. I turned on the interior light and looked back, but there was no one there. For a moment I thought I might be dreaming, but everything felt too real. In the silence I heard a faint sigh, as soft as a whisper. Then I looked down at the passenger seat beside me and saw a wet scarf lying there, drenched from the rain, a scarf I hadn't noticed before. Not knowing what else to do, I drove back in silence, my mind reeling. Her words echoed in my head, about lost souls, about the feeling of being forgotten. Perhaps she was one of them, a soul left behind, wandering between two worlds, never finding peace. That night, the rain continued to fall, blending with the hum of the engine and the shadows of New York City, leaving me with a lingering sense of dread and unanswered questions that would haunt me long after.